Hi, and welcome to this special episode of Our World War II Dad. I'm Chris Cangilla, and joined, of course, by my brother Ken Cangilla. And we created this podcast to share the stories of our father, Army Private First Class Louis T. Cangilla, a soldier with the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate, fighting in Europe during World War II. Now, Ken and I wrapped up our dad's story a few months ago, and we just wanted to come back and honor other veterans with stories about them from their relatives. And we wanted to also kind of check in with Ken and where the other historical sites that he visited in Europe and see those special places.
Yeah, it was great to hear from viewers and listeners that responded to our podcast with their own stories. And every story is special and unique. And so it was great to hear from them. And we heard about, people's grandfathers, their fathers, their uncles, different relationships. But, people my age especially, and even your age to a certain extent, they remember what their relatives went through. And it was great for them to share those stories with us. And then it was really kind of neat to tie it all in with my trip to Europe and the sites that I was able to see. And Dad wasn't at those other sites, but they were very important sites in World War II in the European theater. And so I've got some excellent photos to share with you on that as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to all of that and looking forward to hearing those stories of the other veterans' families and have them share those with us directly. So, we're so excited about doing this, but before we get started, we should probably catch everybody up on what happened since we last did this podcast. Now, this past September, I was able to travel home and see you and the family and our soon-to-be 92-year-old World War II mom, Patricia, who, of course, was our star when she talked with us in episodes 1 and 5.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was kind of a special end of the day when you and I were traveling together that we were able to stop by Fort Logan National Cemetery and drive through those grounds. It's 214 acres, and this was shocking to me. There's 148,000 burials that are already conducted at that cemetery. Now, that includes spouses of soldiers as well, but it's just a very unique place to visit. And you and I were able to find Dad's grave on the first try when we parked and walked to it. And it was nice to stand there for a couple of moments and, kind of reminisce about what you and I had been through on the podcast and what it meant to us to learn a little bit deeper about what our dad was like at 18 years old.
Yeah, I was very thankful to be able to come out and see that. It put kind of this button on most of our discussions from the podcast, and it's such a beautiful area, and I'm glad Dad has that great resting place. It's just amongst all the other soldiers, and you and I were looking at all the other graves there and reading about those guys, and It's incredible. And of course, when we unfortunately do lose Mom, she'll be right there as well. And I think that's a nice honor that the Navy, the United States military does for our vets. So anyway, Let's get back into the reason why we're here. It's about these new veterans that we are going to be introduced to. On our last episode, we asked all of you to, please write in, tell us about, your World War II dad, grandpa, uncle, even a mom or grandma who served in the WWII. It's incredible. These stories are out there and we want to get to them. And so you gave us some great one. And I want to lead it off, if I could, with a story about Louis Scattarelli. Now, Cindy Tuckshire, who told us this story about her World War II grandfather, Louis Scattarelli, just really shared some incredible things. He was from New York, but he raised his family outside of Minneapolis. And his story is such an interesting one, Ken. He served in World War I and World War II. He enlisted in the Army at 16, all right, after the death of his parents. But his sister had him discharged. I'm pretty sure our sisters would do the same thing for us, right?
Yeah.
But when he was old enough, he joined the Army again and served both as a prisoner guard in Russia. So he guarded prisoners in Russia. And then as a violinist in the Army band. So very, two dichotomies there of service in World War I. He was honorably discharged this time after 5 years of service. And then he enlisted in the Navy in 1944 to serve in World War II. He was part of the construction battalion as a motor machinist mate. He served in the Pacific Theater and was in Iwo Jima, and he helped build those runways on the base and the camps and all the roads around there. So he was at one of the most famous sites in battles of the
Yeah.
whole World War II. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting story to hear about him because going in at age 16 in World War I and then serving again in World War II is really unique.
Yeah, he was from the army in Russia in World War I and then in the Navy in World War II. So it's like two wars, different branches, both so far from home, right? But
Exactly.
even more crazy about that is that he got to serve with his sons, Robert and Donald Scattarelli. All of them were in the Navy in World War II. And he met up with them, kind of like our dad met up with his brothers in Hawaii. Both of them were in different units in the Navy during World War II. Incredible that he's serving with his sons and saw them, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. And, there's such a theme of these men running into other relatives or people they know. And it's just such a huge mass of men for that to happen. It's really great to see and hear those stories. But, because of the death of the Sullivan brothers, which was, shown in that movie, Saving Private Ryan, essentially was kind of telling that story that they didn't want family members to serve together in the same unit.
Oh, okay.
And that's why, as a father and son, and it was a good decision, they didn't want to put them together in the same unit, for fear of losing them both at the same time. That family would be devastated. So it's great that he was able to run into his son there in the South Pacific.
Absolutely. And just to put a button on his story, serving both in World War I and World War II, and even getting into the war effort when he's way too young to be doing it, just really kind of goes over his dedication and love for country and wanting to serve. So, that was amazing. Cindy, thank you so much for sharing your story of your World War II grandfather.
Mm-hmm. So I have a story that I was enlightened on from a gentleman in northern Colorado. His name is Arland Ball, and he's from a little town originally from Briggsdale, Colorado, which is a farming town outside of Greeley. And his uncle, Wilbur Ball, was in the South Pacific as well. And he had a really unique story to tell. And he even was able to provide to me some of the photos from when his uncle was in the South Pacific. So to give you a little background on Briggsdale, Wilbur is basically a rancher and a farmer. He's the son of an older couple, Elmer Perry Ball and Etta Ball, who are originally from Kansas, who homesteaded in Colorado in 1913.
Wow.
So they have a ranch outside of Greeley in Briggsdale, Colorado. Wilbur is the fourth of 8 children, and he goes into the Army when World War II started in the South Pacific. And he was attached to G Company of the 35th Regiment of the 25th Infantry Division.
Okay.
And so he's serving directly with them, and he probably could have deferred and not gone into the military because he's raising cattle and they're farming corn and wheat and oats. They're dryland farmers. And typically farmers, because they were providing for the soldiers and the country, they could defer their service. But he chose to go into the military. And he was in a unit, which was a light machine gun unit, which, if you remember in Dad's story, he had training on the Johnston light machine gun. This unit that Sergeant Wilbur Ball is in is a light machine gun unit.
Okay.
So he goes in, he's serving overseas, and there's a book written by his son, Percy Ball, who wrote a story called Sergeant Roach's Story. And he wrote this book about his dad's unit, but there's a chapter in there specifically about his dad, which was really fascinating. So his dad is fighting in the South Pacific, and he is attacking a Japanese position. And I've got a couple of lines from the story that I want to read to you that really tell the story specifically as to what happened to him, because it's really a fascinating story. So let me refer to a couple of the things right from the book. So G and E companies, and he's in G Company, they attacked on Capitalan Ridge at 8:30 in the morning on April 14th, 1945, and they're on an island called Luzon in the Philippines. Okay. G and E companies resumed the attack at 8:30 on the 16th of April, and G Company passed through E Company and attacked 900 yards down a long open ridge to the north and to the northwest, where they encountered Japanese sniper and machine gun fire coming from well-prepared positions. Sergeant Ball wrote and communicated this to Percy Ball, his son, in the book, that the G Company soldiers had left their combat packs back in the rear before beginning the attack earlier that morning. G Company had advanced 40 to 50 yards when Sergeant Cummings of the light machine gun section asked Sergeant Ball to go back and get their packs.
Oh my goodness.
Ball refused to leave the front lines and said, "No, I'm going to stay up here on the front." So Cummings himself went back to get the packs. Bad decision by Sergeant Ball.
Oh no.
Yeah. So Ball wrote that they had left their combat backpacks in the back, but then he participated in the initial skirmish. He had been firing his M1 rifle, the same rifle Dad used, and directing fire at nearly a right angle at a cave opening that was holding a Japanese machine gun nest. So he's kind of at an angle, and he's shooting, and he's trying to knock dirt into their faces because he can't hit them, but he can hit the dirt on the side and just try to obstruct their view because they were raining down fire on the other men that were trying to
From
get
an
across
elevated
the
position,
ravine.
probably.
Of
Right?
course, an elevator.
Yeah.
They're always in an elevated position. So he continues to do this, and someone then passed a message that a Filipino scout attached to his platoon had seen enemy movement at the crest of the wooded hill that they had been assigned to secure a few minutes earlier. Sergeant Ball scanned the crest of the hill and did not detect any enemy movement there, so he was unable to call for suppressive machine gun fire on that position because he couldn't pinpoint it. Ball was kneeling on his left knee and had his right forefinger on the trigger of his rifle when a bullet struck him somewhere in the chest. The high-velocity bullet struck his rifle, knocking it out of his hands, and then passed through his body without knocking him down. He knew he had been hit, but he had no idea of where or how serious the wound was. Ball knew Japanese soldiers carried bolt-action rifles and that he could expect another bullet coming his way in 2 or 3 seconds. He jumped to his feet, dashed about 50 feet to the rear over the crest of a little knoll, and fell exhausted and out of the line of fire. G Company reported that one man was wounded at 11:30, and Sergeant Ball did not walk again until 3 months later. A Japanese sniper had climbed to the top of a tree on the hill beyond the crest where the Japanese were believed to be positioned and had fired a single 25 caliber steel-jacketed bullet. The bullet struck Sergeant Ball's rifle, broke his right collarbone, fractured his 5th right rib, punctured the upper lobe of his right lung, and perforated his right shoulder blade. Okay, so he's hit, and it was a glancing blow off the rifle, which probably saved his life, but he doesn't even go down. He runs to the rear where he knows he can get out of the rain of fire, right?
Yeah. I have a question about this, if you can.
Yeah.
So when that bullet hit, and you don't know this, but maybe you have figured this out. When that bullet hit, it splintered, it exploded, and caused all this other fragmentation, right, into his body. Would that cause more damage than just a bullet going right through? I don't know. It depends on what it hits in his body, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, if that bullet fragmented, it caused more damage. And looking at his wounds here, you can tell it traveled through his collarbone and knocked out his rib, punctured his lung. So there's definitely a good piece of it there that traveled that path and gave him his wounds.
That's amazing.
So the story goes on that the medics waiting behind the front lines for their first casualties of the day quickly gave Ball an injection of morphine to relieve his pain and taped his chest and back to close the open bullet wounds. Then they strapped him to a litter, carried him to the end of what they call bulldozer road that they had cleared out, placed the litter on the pipe supports above one of their evacuation jeeps, and drove him down. The wounded were carefully unloaded from the Jeep and placed at locations on the ground according to the nature and seriousness of their wounds. Sergeant Ball was lying there on the litter when a rather large man leaned over him with a canteen in his hand. He must have noticed that the morphine was wearing off and that Ball was beginning to feel the pain of his wounds. Ball was surprised to discover that this man was Protestant chaplain Captain Shaftland. The chaplain offered the canteen to Ball for what he thought was a drink of water to quench his thirst. You know what's coming, right?
Yes, I do.
Ball reached for the canteen, took a small sip, gagged, and returned the canteen to the chaplain. The chaplain, a good Lutheran, had
Yeah.
offered Ball a good Baptist swig of whiskey to ease the pain of his wounds.
It probably would have come from an Irish Catholic priest too, you know?
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yes.
So Ball is wounded, and in talking to Arlen, he's talking about his uncle.
Yeah.
Arlen tells me that the timing of his wound happened that the hospital ship was already at capacity and had left the port on Luzon. So they load Sergeant Ball on a merchant marine vessel, which is basically a cargo ship, and they start sending him back to America on a merchant marine vessel. And he said they did have some hospital beds on there and some medical personnel, but nothing like the hospital ship. So he has to go from there all the way to San Francisco to be treated, which was a long, long journey. And Arlen says his uncle lost a severe amount of weight. I'm sure he had infection.
Oh
His
yeah.
lung was, he's just in, tough shape. So here's the interesting thing. So Arlen's aunt is a Navy nurse serving in San Francisco. The War Department communicates with Arlen's grandparents, Wilbur's mom and dad,
Yeah.
that he's been wounded and he's being shipped to San Francisco. They get word to Arlen's aunt that he's coming into San Francisco. She stays on top of it. Once he gets there, she's like mother hen. She goes in, finds him immediately, arranges for transportation for him by plane from San Francisco to Denver to be treated at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center.
And that wasn't done very often.
No, so she pulled some strings for
Good
him.
for her.
Yeah, but again, here's, family able to connect with each other far from Briggsdale, Colorado, this little town. She's in San Francisco. He's shipped in there. She gets him to Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center to get the help he needs.
It's amazing. And we're thinking about that in terms like this, where they could use their phones and they can text. And
Yeah.
no, communications was, ancient back
Yeah.
then.
It was telegrams. Yeah.
Telegrams and phones weren't even that big and popular. You have to do
Right.
a party line, especially
Yeah.
from that part of Colorado.
Yeah. Yeah. So he gets to Fitzsimmons, Chris, and he loses a ton of weight. He's just severely ill. He's operated on. They remove the broken fragments of the rib. They get the lung working again. So he's in there, I think, for like 3 months in Fitzsimmons. He finally comes back to Briggsdale, a wounded soldier, a Purple Heart recipient, and he has trouble, lifting his arm on the side where the rib's gone. And Arlen's grandpa, Wilbur's dad, recognizes that if this man's going to farm, he needs to be able to strengthen his arm. So Arlen's grandfather says to Wilbur, if you paint the barn, I will pay you a good wage, because he knew if he painted that whole thing by hand, it would build up his strength, which he did.
It's like the modern day Karate Kid,
Exactly.
Paint the fence, or
Yep.
whatever you're saying in there. He's doing that,
Yep.
getting him strong and healthy again. How did he turn out, Ken?
So he gains his strength, but he decides to use the GI Bill. He goes to Colorado State University and he gets his teaching certificate, and he got it in agriculture because that's his background.
Sure.
And then he taught at high school in Fleming and Berthoud, Colorado, two more farming communities for a while. He goes on to get his master's and PhD, and he taught in the California university system as a professor, and goes on to live a great life, traveled the world, teaching about agriculture, lived a very full life, and came, this close to being killed in action. Luckily, his rifle saved him.
Yeah, what an incredible story. And here's a guy, right, that, is strong and obviously a survivor, that then when he comes back from the war, he uses his brain, right? He uses this other part of him that must be strong too. He must be a brilliant man. CSU is an incredible agricultural school, especially back then, and just gained all that knowledge, all the knowledge he already had from being on the farm for so many years, and really, just educated the world because he traveled it afterwards. What an incredible story.
Yeah.
You got another one in there too, right?
So the other story is, if you remember during our podcast, I had mentioned when we were talking about the age of soldiers, I had mentioned Woody Martin, who was a soldier in the Pacific that they called Gramps.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I dug a little deeper with my brother-in-law, Travis, because it's his father. So I got on the phone with Travis and Tom Martin, his two sons, who are both pretty well-read World War II buffs. And so I wanted to dig deeper into Woody's story, and it's a fascinating story, Chris. So Woody is from a little town in Illinois, your home state, called Shawneetown. Do you
Well,
know where Shawneetown is?
let's not say my home state, because my home
Okay,
state is Colorado, but my adopted
okay.
home state. Yes,
Yeah.
you were remember we talked about this in the podcast. You were born in St. Louis, and that drives you nuts.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not an Illinoisan, if that's a word. Yeah, I'm a Coloradoan living in Illinois. But yeah, he was. You said he was born in Shawneetown,
Shawneetown.
Illinois.
Yeah.
Yes, I do know where that is. That is down south, right on the border. And if memory serves, it's like St. Louis is here, and Nashville's there, and Louisville, Kentucky is there, and it's kind of like right in the middle.
Yeah.
It's really a small town, right?
Yeah, it's a river town on the Ohio River. It's about 325 miles, pretty much straight south of Chicago.
Yeah.
So it's this little town that Woody lives in, and he enlists at about age 29. So he wasn't going to stay home, and he could have, because he was building army bases for a living. And so that was an essential employment as well. And he said, nope, I'm going. And he goes into the Army, and he's originally with the 40th Infantry Division. And then he's attached to the 3rd Battalion, 383rd Regiment, 96th Infantry Division. And he's in what's called JASCO, which stands for Joint Assault Signal Company. So these guys were pretty incredible. So JASCO's job was to be the forward artillery spotters for naval gunfire. So he worked in a two-man unit, himself and a gentleman named George Kern. Now, the Navy would not let an Army guy call in the coordinates for the bombing. So they had to have a Navy guy with an Army guy, and the Navy guy had to call it in. So Woody and George go up to the front lines. They're sneaking around up there, and they have to spot the exact locations to call in the naval bombardments. And they do this on a number of islands. They're on New Britain. They're on Leyte in the Philippines in October of 1944. They're on Luzon in the Philippines in January 1944, which is the same island Wilbur is wounded on. Yeah. Right. And then he's on Okinawa during that battle, and he's there for 82 days. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. It was Okinawa. 82 days on the line. He turned 32 on April 5th. So that's why he was called, Grandpa by the other troops. And this is a man that went in at 22. He's fighting up to age 32 alongside guys that are 18 and 19. So he's Grandpa. So there's some really terrific photos of him. There's some when, he gets out of, basic training, and he's got his, usual military uniform on. But the best photo is one I've admired for years that I've seen. And it's a picture of him and George Kern, and they're kind of leaning against their Jeep, and they're reading a map, and they're probably, communicating coordinates for naval bombardment. And if you look at Woody, his pants are torn, he's dirty, he's skinny, and George is sitting in the Jeep, and the Jeep is covered in mud. And Chris, they had chains on the tire of the Jeep just from the quagmire that they were in because of all the rain they had there. And I look at that picture and I think about the South Pacific, and I'm like, wow, that was a theater of operations that was just intense. You're not only fighting the enemy, you're fighting the elements there.
It's so amazing because like in Europe, it was the cold, the Battle of the Bulge. Yes. These guys are freezing in the snow, right? And then here in the Pacific, it's the mosquitoes, and it's the heat, and it's the mud and the rainforest. Ugh.
Right. Yep. And so what's funny is in talking to Tom Martin and Travis Martin, they relayed a story to me that they had an uncle that was in the Battle of the Bulge. And when their uncle would talk to their dad, they would both go, his uncle would go, I'm glad I wasn't in the Pacific. And Woody'd go, Mom, I'm glad I wasn't in that cold in the Battle of the Bulge. They would compare notes and say they didn't want to be in either theater. But man, I don't know, that South Pacific looks brutal to me.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah. So that picture was taken at a place called Conical Hill, which is a famous hill they battled on. And that battle was just intense on Okinawa. And, your story also relayed the gentleman that was building the base there in Okinawa. So, we've got these guys that are all entwined in this conflict that they're giving forth all this effort to battle the Japanese. And then I had one other picture that I enjoyed seeing. You talked about running into people. So Woody, and I'm not exactly sure where he was, he sees a gentleman walk by, and he sees the name on the shirt without totally recognizing him, but thought he looked familiar. Turns out he's another young man from Shawneetown, this little population 2,000. In the South Pacific, he runs into another man from his same town that he knew, and was able to get a photo taken with him as well. And just really classic moments to see Woody beside that Jeep, just battle worn, and then to run into an acquaintance from his hometown must have felt pretty good.
That's pretty incredible. Yeah, Shawneetown, I think they take their name from the Native American, the Shawnee
Yes.
Indians, right? So
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
yeah, it's an incredible, incredible story, and so many of those names throughout the Midwest are from those Native Americans too. So
Yeah.
crazy.
Yep.
All right, so let me finish up with mine, if you don't mind.
Yes,
I have another story. These are great. I love this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, we got introduced to a gentleman named Walter Director, who served in the Navy, and he was on a ship all around the Mediterranean in World War II. And, it was incredible, his story. But, to learn more about the time there, I was fortunate enough to talk to his daughter, Judy, who shared her story of her World War II dad. So, hi, Judy. Thank you so much for connecting with us. Now, Judy, you have a World War II dad. Can you tell us about him?
Sure. Thank you for having me. My dad served in World War II in the Navy. He was a yeoman, which I found out is, I guess the Army equivalent would be like private first class. He did mostly clerical work. He enlisted in 1942 and served 2 years overseas. He was a year in North Africa and 6 months in Naples and 6 months in Sicily.
Wow. So he was in the heart of it towards the end of the war as well. Do you know anything about what happened there with him? Did he get any action? Did anything?
He didn't talk too much about that. I know the only thing he did share with me that if D-Day would have not worked, he was part of the backup plan. So thankfully D-Day worked.
Wow. Incredible.
So, which is, I think, why they were so long in North Africa, that pushed there.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
But I think most of his work was clerical and, of course, I mean, I can't imagine being in that situation, but, being he talked a little bit about some atrocities that he witnessed and just the brutality of war that he experienced, but he didn't talk very much about that.
Yeah, it seems like those guys really didn't, did they?
No.
So how did he come about joining up? How did he enlist? How did that come around?
So interesting. He, in 1941, he got a job with a company called Morgenthaler, I believe, and they were a defense company. They made parts, I think, for artillery. And so he was exempt. He had an essential job. And so I don't think he thought about enlisting. And then as the war ramped up, and I think part of it was what he saw what was going on, and especially in Europe. And he had some hostile coworkers who, because he was Jewish, made comments that, well, you're here and we're fighting your war for you. So he thought about it and he said, I'll tell you what, I'll go and enlist, and why don't you come with me? And of course, the person did not go with him, but I think it was a commitment that he felt he had to do. So
impressive. It seems like those bullies really never follow through. They're just cowards deep down inside. So
yes.
That's incredible that your dad did it and called him right out and said, I'm going, you want to come with?
Yep.
Never happened. So now I know, of course, you came about, your mom was there. Did your dad, did you meet her before the war, after the war? How did that all take place?
He met her before the war. I think it was actually a blind date. And they met in 1941 and they became engaged that September. And they got married in January. And I'm not sure when exactly the decision was made to go over and to enlist, but here's my mom, 19 or 20 years old, and I can't even imagine what she must have gone through. But he enlisted. He did, I think, some of his training in Roanoke, Virginia. I know that for sure. And I know some of his training. He mentioned Mobile, Alabama, and my mother mentioned that because being a Brooklyn girl, that was like a whole other country to her. So she did spend a little time during his basic training.
That's right. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, like from what
Yeah.
you've told us about, that your dad was from Brooklyn and
Right.
and spent most of his time there. And then what you said about, him marrying your mom, did you mention that he did that kind of right before he went off? I mean, it was one of those kind of
I think
situations.
so. I
Yeah.
think so. I mean, they were engaged in September of 41, and I think it was probably because of the situation and the times that they decided to get married as quickly as they did. But,
Yeah. How old was your dad? Do you know when he was first over there?
21 or 22.
Kid. These
Yeah,
guys are just
I
kids.
know. I
It's
know.
it's it's incredible. What do you know about what he did? I know you said that he was, clerical, but important
Yeah.
jobs there too. Anything about what he did? I assume he was on a boat. Do you know the boat or anything? I shouldn't say boat. They're ships, but
The ship, right?
yeah, yeah,
Big boat.
yeah.
I'm not sure the name of the ship. I know that once he got over there, a lot of what he told me that he met a lot of other guys in his I don't know what you call it, in his troop or in his group, and there were several that were illiterate,
Hmm.
and so he assigned himself the job of teaching them how to read. So that was part of what he did, and he also figured out very quickly that he was the only Jew in his troop, so he made himself the assistant um, to the pastor there, and he said he'd be the assistant.
To help with the rabbi work
Right,
of that chaplain, if you will.
chaplain. That's the word I was thinking of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's amazing how that's what I love about these things. Like a chaplain did all the services for all
Right.
the different denominations. So why can't we all just be like chaplains and just say, hey, this is all good, no matter what you are. Let's do
No
it all
kidding.
together. Exactly.
Not
Very
that
cool.
difficult, right?
It's not that difficult. So we've all heard about the terrific book that Tom Brokaw did, The Greatest Generation, and it's just so wonderful. But your dad has kind of a connection with that book. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. And he when he first heard about the book, of course, he went out and read it, and um, found out that Tom Brokaw had a project at Florida State University, and where he was amassing all these letters from different people who served. And so my father wrote to him and sent him all his information. And those letters were included in the exhibit at Florida State. And so he started a correspondence with Tom Brokaw, and it continued for a little while. So
That's very cool. Now, you shared with us a letter that he sent Tom Brokaw about, thanking him for that exhibit. And
right.
then he had a follow-up letter. Can you tell us about the follow-up letter?
Yes, that was my dad. So he figured as long as he had a journalist's ear, he would pursue it. So he mentioned the fact that he wanted to bring up that his generation, he called himself a notch baby. I'm not sure what that means, but they were, I guess they didn't get the pay that they felt that they were deserved. And so he thought maybe Tom Brokaw could do something to help him with that.
Then maybe Tom had a little pull. So
Yeah,
your dad not only helping other veterans read, but he's also trying to get them a little extra cash from the government after they did their incredible service. So a
yes,
man
and
of quality.
and that was his personality. So
That's great. Now tell us about how the family got started. Now your dad was in Brooklyn. He returned from the war. I'd like to know what he did and how you guys came about and all those things.
sure. So my dad got home from the war, and of course the GI Bill enabled him to pursue what he wanted to pursue, and he always loved photography. And it so happened that he had an uncle who ran a photography school in Los Angeles. So he and my mom moved to Los Angeles, and my dad went to that school, and um, I forget how many. I think it was a 2-year program, and he graduated from the program. And I still have a lot of his photographs. They're really some beautiful photographs, and of course, something to treasure. And he, the practical side of him, said that I need to do something else to supplement this. So he ended up working in retail at a camera store. and they moved to San Francisco. I believe, I'm not sure how he got that job, but he moved to San Francisco, and that's where I was born. And about maybe a year later, they moved back to New York, and my dad worked in another camera store, and eventually went into the camera wholesale business and got an opportunity in Chicago. And so when I was about 5 or 6, we moved to Chicago, and he stayed in the camera business all those years, and eventually moved back to New York, and then retired in New Jersey. So.
Wow, it's an incredible story. Now, unfortunately, your dad and mom are no longer with us, but
yes,
I know very close to your heart. Could you share some of those photos with us? And what's your favorite one that you still have of his that he might have taken?
He took one photo that there were a lot of photos he took of family members. You know, he had built-in models, so he had there's some beautiful photographs of my grandparents that he took, and there was one special photograph that he called it Exodus, and he was very involved after the war. He was very involved with the start of the state of Israel, and he was concerned about the Jewish refugees. And in fact, my mother worked during the war at a refugee relief organization, so
Wow.
that was a big concern. And so he took a photograph of it's a person walking. So you see the legs walking on the beach, and he kind of superimposed it. So it's just a beautiful photograph. And that's one that I have hanging in my house. And I think it's my favorite of his.
That's terrific. Well, he sounds like such a wonderful man. And I'm glad that, you have these good memories and you're able to come on here and talk about us, because we got to tell these stories, right?
Absolutely.
You've lost your folks. I've lost my dad. And it's going to die with us unless we keep on getting it out there and sharing. So I can't thank you enough for sharing, your World War II dad with us.
Thank you. And thank you for doing this, because it's very important work and we need to remember.
Absolutely. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you.
What an incredible story that Judy was able to share about her dad with us. That was really kind of her. And it's amazing. My takeaway from that is that I saw in him, from her story, this man that's really involved in helping Israel, and really that is a big part and important to him. And it really parallels what's going on there today. I'm sure if he was around today, he would be so involved in helping, that incredible country and what they're going through. It seems so cyclical, these things that happen. I just hope it doesn't end in another world war. But anyway, he was an incredible man.
Yeah, he really was. And, watching Judy speak about her father, it reminded me of the saying, all gave some and some gave all. Walter enlisted when he didn't have to, and he did his best in every capacity to serve his country, but also serve his fellow man by trying to teach some of the others how to read while he's on the ship with them. So what a great guy.
Yeah, I'm so thankful to her for sharing those stories. And of course, all the other stories that we've shared here today came to us from others. So thank you very much for those viewers and listeners to our podcast that shared their story. And I'm glad we were able to share them with you all today. And I hope we did them justice.
Yeah, Chris, these stories shared with us by the viewers and the listeners are so important to capture. The United States is losing about 131 World War II veterans per day. It is estimated that there are only about 119,500 of the World War II U.S. veterans still alive today. So we must all strive to remember this sacrifice because it's so very important.
Absolutely. You speak so much the truth right there. It's vital. It's important. So we don't repeat the past, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Let's shift gears a little bit and go to these other sites that you had the opportunity to visit. Now, these are sites, right, that Dad didn't fight in, but were just monumental and really cool for you to see, right?
Yeah, from just reading about World War II history, I knew they were important sites to see, and some were very near to where Dad was. So, with some of the time I had on vacation in Europe, I wanted to make sure I stopped by these important sites. So, the first one I stopped by was only about 13 miles from Malmedy, which is, from our earlier podcast, that's where Dad was through Christmas in 1944 and into January, fighting the Battle of the Bulge. So there was a significant battle just 13 miles away at a place called Gleize, Belgium. And the reason I went to that site is there is a preserved German King Tiger tank that sits on the grounds there still. And you get a tour, you can tour the tank, and there's a museum that's nearby as well. And the story about the tank is the Germans, on their push into the Battle of the Bulge, were on the high ground as usual, defending the Wehrmont farm or Wehrmont farm. I'm not sure how you say it. And on December 24th, 1944, the U.S. Third Armor advanced up the valley. So I drove this same valley the armor came up, and I mean, it had to be treacherous to bring the tanks up that road. And so this King Tiger tank is waiting for them at the top of the road. The King Tiger tank fires upon them, misses, and our guys get off a good shot, and they take out the main gun on this King Tiger tank. And the crew of the Tiger tank knows without their main gun, they're worthless. So they bail out and scurry away. And so the tank is captured. The interesting thing about this is a tiny little town, L'Église. A local innkeeper's wife bought the tank from the U.S. Army for a bottle of cognac because she had the foresight to know that if she could preserve this tank, she could use it as kind of a tourist attraction to help their inn there. And so she bought the tank for a bottle of cognac. They welded on something to, make the gun look repaired. The tank still sits there today. And so I went up and looked at the tank. You can see battle damage on the tank. The thing is massive. I can't imagine, as an 18, 19-year-old kid having to go up against one of these tanks. They were so foreboding and scary to face. And it sits there in the same spot it was. And you can see the terrain behind them, that they had the high country. You get a real feel for what the Battle of the Bulge was like in L'Église.
Yeah, what an incredible story, and that foresight of the tavern owner. That's incredible. That's so. I mean, that's so thinking of these days of marketing and promotion and using all those things. That's incredible. When we think about tanks, the thing that comes to mind, I don't know if you remember this movie, and I can't remember. It could be the Big Red One. I'm not sure. Where the soldiers dig into the sand on the beach, and the tanks are rolling over them, and you can hear some of them. Oh, it was just an incredible scene. I remember one of those movies. I'm sure one of our viewers would remember what movie that is. And those tanks were scary. Anytime you hear that, just that
rattle and
then the slow moving is almost like in a horror movie when the bad guy is chasing after me. He's walking and you're running.
Right.
Those tanks were for that. That's how the tanks were for me.
Yeah. Chris, you got to see one up close and impersonal someday, because they are massive and very frightening. So that was interesting to see. So from there, we jumped in the RV and we drove on to a little town called Foy, which is near Bastogne. So if you remember in Band of Brothers, there's a big segment of the series that takes place in Bastogne and in Foy. So I wanted to see that because I was so enthralled with that movie. So Foy is only 39 miles from Malmedy. So again, you get a feel for how close Dad was to what Easy Company was going through and what he was going through up in Malmedy with the 99th Infantry Battalion. So as usual, when I get to a little town, where do I start? With the church. So we go to the little church and start to head out from there. And of course, I'm driving this 24-foot RV, so I got to find a place to park. I drive past the church and I park. I get out and start taking pictures and looking around. Well, the interesting thing is I parked at a really prime spot, because as I walked back to the church and looked back upon it, took some photos of it, I watched the Band of Brothers movie when I got back home again. And Chris, they did such a good job capturing the essence of that church. They're almost identical in the movie and compared to what I was able to see in person. And there's even an old photo from World War II that shows kind of after the battle at Foy. And there's the ambulances there, and they're getting the wounded loaded and things like that. And it's looking right up the same street where I parked the RV. So then I did some further study, and I started looking down the street towards the church from where I parked the RV. And what it turns out to be is that I'm parked exactly where Shifty Powers takes out the sniper that's in the building in the series when the sniper starts shooting at the soldiers that are kind of celebrating the victory. There was a leftover sniper there. So I was able to stand in the exact same spot that Shifty took the shot of, see the window the sniper's in. The building is still there, Chris, and you can see all the pockmarks in the building from all of the bullets that hit it. And it's just fascinating to see. Even some of the pockmarks, people had put poppy flowers in there, which is a memorial to the soldiers that fought there. And so to be able to see that exact spot where they reenact that in the movie was just fascinating to think about. Those soldiers having to fight the sniper at that point and get a feel for the distance that he had to take that shot.
Yeah, that Band of Brothers series, and every episode of that series just really, it brought it home for me when I watch it, because like you said, it looks so real and it's so authentic. It's an incredible series.
Yeah, and they did a good job really matching it up. So across the street from the church is kind of this hotel, this inn. And when I was walking around there, they have tours going on there. And the tour guide was kind enough to say, "Hey, are you aware of what happened at this hotel across the street?" And I said, "No." So he shows me a picture of the black and white photo from the Battle of the Bulge. There's this German tank that's parked next to this hotel. And the reason he's parked there is there was kind of a slope in the ground where he could kind of be below the ridge a little bit. Wow. And he's facing up towards the church and up the hill towards where Shifty took out the sniper. And he's got a great angle on the soldiers without exposing the tank. And so I was able to get a picture of that exact same location and see where the tank was back in 1944 or into 45. It was probably January by then. And to see it today. And it hasn't changed very much. It's very, very similar. So it's just fascinating to see what took place in Foy.
It's so cool that they preserved a lot of these things. I know we've lost a lot of things, but these ones that are preserved are incredible.
Yeah. So from there, we drove into the woods where Easy Company was waiting to attack Foy. So it's called the Bois Jacques Woods, and it stands for Jacques Woods in French. Okay. So we drove up there, which is not far. It's a farmer's field away. And you can still see some of the foxholes that Easy Company had dug. Now, some of them reenactors had redug, but there's some originals still there. So you see the foxholes. You can appreciate what they were looking down on when they see this Foy, this town of Foy that they have to attack. And then there's a memorial there to Easy Company, and it lists the men that were killed in action while in those foxholes, and it shows some of the common names that you see in the Band of Brothers series. So it's really neat to have immerse myself in that movie and then be able to stand in those same places and really appreciate the distances.
That's really cool. And I always, we started doing this podcast kind of from when you shared that photo of the real life in 1944 and then what it looks like today. So it's kind of the same thing when we look at the series Band of Brothers. You kind of see these sites and you kind of say, hey, do those really exist? And you kind of went on that quest and see if you can find them.
Yeah, you're so right. It started with that Malmedy Town Square that I shared with you that you were able to find on Google Earth. And then that's what just piqued my interest so much to keep diving into these things. So it was great to see those battles that the Band of Brothers were in Bastogne and Foy and really appreciate the distances and what they were up against.
Where'd you go next?
So from there, we had a little bit of driving to do, and we went to Omaha Beach, which is, a place. Anybody that visits Europe that's an American, if you have the chance, you should visit there. It's very touching. It's where so many of our young men gave their lives to really keep freedom in the world. And so we went there, and they have a very good visitor center. Before you enter the cemetery, you go through the visitor center. And they show a movie every few minutes before you go into the museum part. And the movie really focuses on 3 soldiers that were killed on Omaha Beach. And it tells really their story. And it makes it very personalized to understand what each of these men gave on that beach. So you go through the movie and then you walk through the museum. And if you remember in the podcast, I showed you pictures from that same museum of infantrymen and what they wore. Well, they also have a mannequin there, Chris, that is of the paratroopers, which is what Easy Company was, the 506 PRIR, 101st Infantry or paratroopers. So you get to see what they're wearing in there, and it's really neat to take a look at that. And then they also have, this is something I didn't know of, we had actually dropped dummies with parachutes on in a different part of France, over by, I think it was by Le Havre, and to make the Germans think that the paratroopers were coming in there. And they have one of those dummies from back in the day. And it's really fascinating to look at that we dropped these in there by the thousands to think that, a whole nother invasion was coming.
Did you know if that worked very much? Do we know anything about it?
It did work. In fact, it really slowed the Germans down from redistributing their troops into the Omaha Beach area, because they held them further to the east where they thought we were coming in. And even prior to us launching, the shortest way across was of the channel was at that Le Havre area there, and we had blow up tanks. They were made by movie companies to look like we had staged tanks and all kinds of aircraft and stuff like that. So they thought we were building up the effort there, and we faked them out, and
Great
it really
deception.
helped. Yeah, it was great deception.
When you're talking about the entry in the visitor center into the cemetery at D-Day there, you brought up how you kind of follow a soldier through the whole process, one of three, right? And it really reminded me of my tour of the Holocaust Museum in D.C., because when you enter that, they give you a name, a person that was, one of the Holocaust prisoners or taken, and you go through the whole museum, and at the end, you find out if they lived or they died.
Wow.
So it's a really personal way of kind of following that, and I believe that's the same reason why they did it for, the D-Day Museum there.
Yeah,
at Omaha
absolutely.
Beach, because it really ties in that this isn't just something you see on TV. This is actual life and death.
It is. It really brings it home, and you forget about just the big picture of it, and you see the personal loss and sacrifice that these veterans gave us. It's really touching. Yeah. So the last thing I saw in the museum was they have a Jeep, and of course it made me think of Dad, since he was a Jeep driver in the 99th Infantry Battalion. So it's really kind of neat to see one of the Jeeps from D-Day there. So after you leave the visitor center, you go out to the cemetery itself. So you go out to the cemetery. It's about 172 and a half acres. There's 9,388 burials there. It contains the remains of American military dead, most of whom were killed during the invasion of Normandy and ensuing military operations in World War II in that area. Included are graves of Army Air Corps crews shot down over France as early as 1942, because they gave their lives building up to it. And there are 4 American women buried there. Now, I don't know the rest of the story on that. I wonder if they were, hospital workers or something that came ashore shortly thereafter. But it'd be interesting to know about these 4 American women. So if anybody knows about that, any of our listeners, I would love to hear the rest of the story on how the 4 American women were buried at the American Cemetery there at Omaha Beach.
Extremely interesting. And of course, there should be a movie about them as well. So I'd love to learn about that. Go ahead.
Wouldn't that be interesting? Okay, so the cemetery contains the graves of 45 pairs of brothers, 30 of which are buried side by side. So, knowing Dad's story with him having 4 brothers there, it just really brings it home that there were a lot of brothers that were killed and are buried together. There's a father and a son buried there. There's an uncle and his nephew. There's 2 pairs of cousins, 3 generals, 4 chaplains, 4 civilians, the 4 women I mentioned, 147 African Americans, and 20 Native Americans buried at the American Cemetery there on French soil.
So when would this Sullivan policy be enacted? Because if it was enacted before then, which it probably wasn't, they might have not been in the same units. Or did we have so many guys in so many different units there that they could have been relatives?
I think they were in different units, but they were on the same assignment to attack the beaches. So, they weren't fighting side by side, but they were on the same beaches. Therefore, they ended up there. And the brothers could have been killed, a week or 2 into the advance as well. So a lot of different stories going on there. And then probably the most heartbreaking is there's 304 unknown soldiers that are buried among the other service members. And the headstone for them reads, "Here rests in honored glory a comrade in arms known but to God." So they have that memorial for them there as well.
That is such a powerful thing. And when I was also in D.C., we went to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And you want to see dedication. And I believe they're Marines that march back and forth guarding the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in 365 days a year, rain, snow,
or shine,
whatever, they're there. And it's just incredible. It was so powerful to see that happening. And And I know that the same thing over there in the D-Day area of Normandy,
Yeah.
in that cemetery, it has the same probably feelings, even maybe more so.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting when you're there, Chris. You could hear a pin drop. People are so solemn and respectful of where they are and recognize what's going on. So, and one of the fascinating things, and I don't remember if I talked about this in the podcast or not, but they bring French students there, and the French teachers teach the students about soldiers that were killed, basically freeing their country. So that country really remembers and respects what took place on June 6, 1944 for them.
That's nice to know.
Yeah.
That's really nice to know. I wish we did a little bit more of that here in the old USA, but
yeah, I hear you.
There's still time to learn that stuff.
Sure.
Absolutely.
So from there, we ventured a little bit further west, and we had the RV, so we were looking for a campground. So we pulled into this campground. I forget what it was called, but it wasn't far from Omaha Beach at all. And we discover this German machine gun bunker that's really just outside the fringe of the campground. And so you can explore it. It's still just there. And it's this concrete bunker. And I went inside of it and I looked down the fields of fire. And this thing is set up so it can look all down Omaha Beach, perpendicular to the beach, or I should say parallel to the beach, because it could shoot right down the beach.
Right.
Parallel to the beach, just a field of fire that was just unbelievable to be able to stand in that bunker and see what our troops faced. So then I walked down the causeway from there onto the beach and explore the area of the beach there. And there were two causeways in this area where I was. One was a very narrow causeway that comes up towards that machine gun bunker. I mean, and it's narrow enough that you could be 2 or 3 men wide.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, and you're facing this machine gun bunker, gone your way up. Down further on the beach, I come across a German 88 millimeter gun that's in the bunker still, and it's aiming down the beach even further. And this gun was just powerful, so powerful. And so it's still there. You can view it and see what it looked like in its field of fire, and just how devastating the fire must have been on those men crossing that beach. And if you look at that beach, Chris, it was low tide, so they had to cross a lot of sand before they could get up closer to the hills, and it was so well guarded.
Yeah, it seems like, they're doing the approach, and I'll kind of use my hands here. They're going this way, right, up the beach. But
yes.
That gun is coming from the sides.
Yes.
So you're looking up. The other guns are coming from the high ground. You're looking up there trying to dodge that stuff, and they're coming from the sides. They were just in this kill zone. It was horrible.
It was.
But they fought through it and got in there. It's just, it's just a shallow. I could see the water. It looks shallow.
Yeah.
The landing there has just got to be tough. And those 88s, I remember hearing how those sounded in the films and the documentaries I've seen. Those 88s were just the loudest and big.
They were
guns.
devastating. Yeah. Those men were so brave to take that on. So part of the wreckage that's still there is what's called a Mulberry Harbor. So what a Mulberry Harbor is I forget who, I think a British man designed this. They knew they had to build harbors out there in order to offload all the equipment we needed to continue the invasion into France. So they built these concrete Mulberry Harbors that were concrete forms that, once they were poured, there was air inside of them so they would float. They towed those over and connected them in a chain so that you could dock ships up against them and offload the cargo. So there's still one sitting there at the beach where we were, and it's huge, and it's fascinating to see it. It's got a hole in it. That's why it's kind of sunk and half submerged. But the engineering was magnificent, and just to see that piece of Omaha Beach was quite a historical thing as well.
Right. Those guys in the construction battalion, like we talked about earlier,
yes.
Those are the kind of guys that build
those
that
are the
stuff,
guys.
Right? Yeah.
Yep, crazy. Absolutely. Those are the guys that put that stuff together. They played a very important role as well. So from there, we moved about 4 miles west of Omaha Beach to a place called Pointe du Hoc. And this is the cliffs that the U.S. 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions had to assault. So these cliffs are 110 feet high, and we're going to send men up these cliffs to attack these positions. And I had known a little bit about this, but I wanted to see it in person. And what I didn't realize was how steep the cliffs were. And at the very top of the cliffs are machine gun bunkers I don't know how you pop your head over the cliff and survive. And these guys were willing to shoot grappling hooks up there, put ladders up there, et cetera, to get up those cliffs. So we toured that area, and there's huge bomb craters there from our Navy artillery that tried to soften up the defenses. And it was really interesting to see it in person. So the plan there at Pointe du Hoc was for 3 companies of the Rangers to be landed by sea at the foot of the cliffs, scale them using ropes, ladders, and grappling hooks while under enemy fire, and then engage the enemy at the top of the cliff. As the Rangers scaled the cliffs, the Texas, the Scattarelli, the Ellison, and the Talabont continued to provide fire support on the top of the cliff and ensured that the German defenders above could not fire down on the assaulting troops. So, but you got to time it right. You got to stop firing from the naval ships in order for the guys to come up the hill, right? So the cliffs proved to be higher than the ladders could reach.
Oh, geez.
When the Rangers made it to the top of Pointe du Hoc, they had sustained 15 casualties. The force also found that their radios were ineffective. Upon reaching the fortifications, most of the Rangers learned for the first time that the main objective of the assault, the artillery battery, had been removed, and they had moved it further inland. For some reason, I don't know why, but they had moved them further back. So they did all this struggle to take out these big guns, and the big guns weren't there. The Rangers regrouped at the top of the cliffs after fighting up the cliff, and a small patrol went off in search of the guns. 2 different patrols found 5 of the 6 guns nearby. The 6th one was being fixed elsewhere, and they destroyed their firing mechanisms with thermite grenades, so they were successful in knocking out the guns. So when I toured these cliffs in this area up there, these bunkers were elaborate, and we walked through the bunkers, and you look at these bunkers and you know our soldiers have to attack them. And so the entrance to the bunkers is in the back, and then the gun ports are to the front towards the ocean. So if you circle around to the back and you try to attack one of these bunkers, they were so well designed that there were gun ports facing usually 2 or 3 fields of fire that you had to run the gauntlet down these steps into the bunker. And you didn't just run straight into a bunker. You had to turn left and then right and then left again. And there were gun ports at every turn. I don't know how our men were able to ever clear these bunkers. The angles that they had were just unbearable for our soldiers, but somehow they were able to do it.
That's incredible. 2 things that came to mind when you're telling us this story is what I'm thinking about. It's modern warfare. Think about this. The gentlemen that were, you're trying to time out between, the Navy bombardment and, of course, our guys coming up, and there's no communication. We already talked about this. It's hard to communicate these things. So they don't know when it's safe to go in there if their radios aren't working. Nowadays, they're communicating through so many different means. A lot of the guys have cameras and, earpieces and, and can hear and see everything that's going on. So you think about that. And then you also think about, okay, so in this, conversation about, them knowing where these targets are. And you talked about it in the case of the gentleman that was a sniper and his buddy that would go and kind of call on the coordinates for the bombings, that we were talking about.
Right.
And, in modern day, they use what they call, lasers, and they paint the target. That's how they do it. And that wasn't done there. So our guys doing the things they did with that limited technology is just an incredible feat.
Yeah, it really is. It's been 80 years, so a lot has changed since then, and the equipment they were dealing with was archaic compared to now, but they forged ahead and they got the job done.
Absolutely.
So to round out the story on Pointe du Hoc, so some of the bunkers I toured, you can see, I talked about how hard it was to get into them. When you go in the bunkers, you can see the charred ceilings. So our guys used flamethrowers when they couldn't advance. They probably threw grenades as best they could in there and used flamethrowers. So it's fascinating to see what it's like to be inside one of those bunkers during D-Day.
Wow.
So from there, Chris, we went on to Carentan. And I wanted to see Carentan once again because of the Band of Brothers movie. I knew it was a big battleground, not too far from Omaha Beach at all, a little bit further to the west of Omaha Beach and a little bit more inland. So once again, we started at the church in Carentan because it's always the center, and just a really beautiful church there that we were able to go inside and see. And then as I walked around and took pictures and filmed some video, it was really precious to see these French kids out of school, they were doing some kind of scavenger hunt, and to see them, they were all marching around trying to do different things in town. And they were out in the square. And as I got to the square, there's of course a monument there, and there were fresh flowers still on that monument. And I realized that I was there on May 12th, and VE Day was May 8th. So here we are, almost 80 years later, in the French, and these ribbons were in French and everything. We're still laying flowers at these monuments to the men who had sacrificed so much to free Carentan on that day. And of course, Easy Company was at Carentan. There's a great scene, a great battle that takes place there. And so as I compared my pictures from Carentan back to the movie, the Band of Brothers series, it just struck me how the arches in the town square perfectly match the arches you see in the movie. And they did such a good job of depicting that. And it's really fascinating to see that.
Wow, that's so cool.
So as we were driving out of Carentan, I had to take one more picture, and it was a sign that pointed towards a little town called Barneville. And do you remember where Barneville is and what the significance of that is?
Yeah. Is that the place where Dad had to go and they put him in those trucks and real uncomfortable? I mean, it's probably not as uncomfortable as those rail cars we talked about in one of those podcasts, but it's like on the coast or something. Is that right?
Yes, it's on the coast, and they were sent there to defend against. There was two islands that had German occupation still, Guernsey and Jersey, and so they were on that coast from February to about April of 1945. I saw the sign, had to take a picture, knew I was close, but I was on my way further south to a new location.
What was up next?
So, at this stage, I had really dug into the World War II stuff. And my wife, God bless her, Dawn's with me. And I'm like, okay, let's do some stuff you want to do. And let's go see some of the chateaus and things like that down in the Loire Valley that you'd like to see. So we drive down to the Loire Valley. And one of the chateaus we go to is called Chateau Chenonceau, and just a gorgeous chateau. It dates back to the 1500s. And so you and I would equate it to like almost a castle, but to them it was just kind of a mansion. And it sits on the river Cher. And it actually spans the river. It goes from one side of the river to the other. They built it over the river. Back from the 1500s, this is an incredible feat. And so we toured the chateau, and it was really neat to see. But of course, the World War II stuff comes back to me because as I'm reading, poor Don, I'm reading the history of this place. And what I find out is because it spanned the river, the chateau owners were able to smuggle French resistance people from the German occupied side of France across the river into the southern part of France, which is where the French Vichy government was set up. The Vichy government was the ones that had negotiated with the Germans to kind of surrender and say, we'll play nice and everything like that. So they used the chateau to smuggle these people back. And so the Grand Gallery is the part that spans the river, and it's just a beautiful big hall. And it became the sole point of access to the free zone. And the chateau owners were the Menier family at the time. They smuggled out people fleeing the Nazi tyranny. And when Harry Truman, who followed up after FDR was president, and he visited France, it was one of the places he visited when he was in France. So very significant. And then I read more history, and this isn't World War II, but this is World War I. That same chateau in World War I used some of their buildings to set up a field hospital for World War I soldiers. So these people were very dedicated to taking care of the French soldiers in that area and the French freedom fighters at the same time. So, we weren't supposed to be doing World War II stuff anymore, but we stumbled upon this beautiful chateau that spans this river that played a role in World War II. So we toured a number of chateaus in that area, which was great. The other chateaus didn't have World War II significance, so that was good.
Yeah.
So we moved from there, and we're kind of starting to wrap up our trip now. And we've turned in the RV. Now we're just on foot in cab, and we're in Paris. Oh. So, you're seeing the usual sights in Paris, right? So we decide we're going to go see the Louvre. So we did a lot of walking. So we're walking towards the Louvre, and I'm walking by this building, Chris, and, I'm always looking around for World War II stuff. So I look across the street, and I'm looking at this building that's right next door to the Louvre, and it's got battle damage on it. I mean, you can see bullet holes. You can see tank artillery shells. This building is damaged. So I start looking around, and I'm like looking across the street at this building. So I look at the building that's to my back, and it is the police precinct for Paris. And there's a sign there, and it's all in French. So with my phone, I was able to take a picture of it and translate it. And so I was able to read the translation, and the sign said, "In memory of Raymond Bousson, head of the second group of the Corps de France and the Prefecture of Police, died here August 20th, 1944, while in combat." So we had dropped leaflets on Paris saying, we're close, hang on. So the police department, who's armed, because the Nazis didn't want to run the local police, so they let them run their own police. These guys are armed. They turned their armament on the Nazis and start fighting before the Americans get there. And
they went too early. They went too early.
Yeah, but they were probably just so angry and just ready to regain their city. And you can see this man fell there, and then there's this battle damage. I go around the corner, and you can see this huge pockmark in this marble building where it had to be a tank artillery shell had hit. And it's just like, I'm walking through Paris, and it's 2023, and I'm looking at this battle damage that's still there from the liberation of Paris.
What a dichotomy, because you think of Paris and fashion and cutting edge and all that stuff, and neon lights and all that kind of stuff, and then right next to it is battle damage from World War II.
Yeah, it's just amazing to walk among that stuff and see it. And of course, we went to the Arch de Triomphe, and we were able to see that as well, and that's very significant. Of course, there's historical pictures of Hitler driving through there, and then there's pictures of our troops finally coming through there. It's been there since Napoleon, so it was interesting to see that as well. So those are some World War II things that came up in Paris as well. So from Paris, we got on the Eurostar, I think it's called, and rode the train from Paris to London, and spent the last part of our trip in London, walked around there, and we went to a church. It's called St. Dunstan. It's a 1,000-year-old church. And you had talked about the Blitz in the podcast, how you had run into a woman from England, and she was talking to Dad. She was still upset about the Blitz when she was relaying the story to Dad. So we are experiencing the Blitz firsthand. This church at St. Dunstan, it's 1,000 years old. It was bombed during the Blitz. The roof is gone, but the walls still stand. And they never rebuilt it. They just left the roof off of it, and the walls are there. Well, these trees have grown up in the last 79, 80 years. They've planted gardens in there. So now it's kind of this interesting open air garden with church walls that you can walk through.
Like a living memorial now, kind of.
It is a good way to put it, Chris. It's a living memorial of the Blitz, and it's just a very peaceful place now, unlike it was, back in 41, 42, and 43. So we toured that, and then we walked all over the city of London. And my last World War II stop was to take a picture of the statue of Churchill. It's at the Palace of Westminster at Parliament Square. And it's this great statue of Churchill, who I really admire because he led that country through the darkest of times. And he sat down with FDR. They figured out a great plan. And then our dad and other World War II dads and uncles and grandfathers went out there and executed that plan and kept freedom in the world. Yeah, those two built this strong relationship that we still have today with Great Britain. And thankful to have that friendship and that partnership because, of our two countries, what they did in World War II really built that as a foundation for sure. They sure did. What an incredible time you had. Thank you so much for sharing this stuff, stuff that Dad wasn't even at, but just, just brings back these feelings of just satisfaction and pride in what we accomplished over there and just really brought it home for you. So that's an incredible thing. Depending on when people are going to listen to this or view this podcast, for us, our family, it's an important time because Veterans Day is just around the corner. And it's such a special time because Veterans Day is on November 11th, as many of you all know. And Dad passed away on November 12th. And Mom's birthday is November 13th. And this year in 2023, she'll be 92. So it's an incredible weekend for us to be, honoring veterans, honoring our dad, who was a veteran, and honoring the people that supported
these veterans, like our mom and so many other moms and grandmas out there. So just an incredible weekend coming up.
Yeah, it is. It really is, Chris. Yeah. And they deserve all the credit. They've done so much for this country. So our hats are off to all those veterans on Veterans Day.
Absolutely. All right. It's been fun, brother. Thank you so much for doing this again with us. It's just, I love these times that we spend together. So I appreciate it so much, your time and your knowledge base on this.
Well, you're welcome. And I've enjoyed the time as well.
Very good. All right. For all of our listeners and viewers out there, don't forget to, sit down with your parents or your grandparents, relatives, ask them questions about how they grew up. But be sure to grab your phone and record them so you have that for later on. You'll be so happy you did. For my brother, Ken Cangilla, I'm Chris Cangilla, and thank you for joining us as we talk about veterans and our World War II dad. Thanks for watching and listening to Our World War II Dad. Please remember to like and subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
And if you're just listening to the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it.